You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the 2006 documentary American Scary, all about horror host, the horror host tradition, and more. Here we go. Are we talking about something? We're talking about something, Pete. We're talking about something on the Fan2Fan Podcast. One of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. That was Pete Charbonneau, co-host extraordinaire. We have Fan2Fan All-Star, John Zemke, returning and joining us to talk about a fun topic. John, thanks for coming on so we can talk about horror hosts.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
This week on Svengoolie...
You were dead.
Dead? Who?
The mummy.
Which mummy?
The mummy of Clarice.
Oh, that one.
How stupid can you get?
It's Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. Saturday night on MeTV.
And as someone who grew up in Chicago, Svengoolie is just part of my DNA. Berwyn, rubber chickens, no personal checks. If you grow up in Chicago, like you've just heard of that peripherally, maybe firsthand because you saw it. And I think as Svengoolie has gotten more national attention, MeTV has grown to become what it's become. Svengoolie has become basically, I would almost argue, the horror host of the nation, especially for something that is really regional, or at least it was when it was kind of like in its heyday. There's just something really niche, but also neat, very charming about the idea of horror hosts. And we'll kind of get into it because we all watched this documentary called American Scary.
Everybody had their own influences by whoever was on in their city.
My first horror host was Roland.
My horror host was Zachary because I grew up in the New York area.
We're both big Zachary fans. It was Channel 9, I think, WOR in New York that we watched him on.
I have to say Ghoulish was the greatest because that's who I grew up with.
The thing that worked best about Ernie is he didn't care.
It was the first time you saw a host anywhere and go, man, this show's a turkey tonight, gang.
When I would do things with him, I felt like I couldn't go wrong.
When I was watching Sir Cecil Creep, I was at an age that a lot of the programming that was aimed at me would have a host.
Yes, that's what we need. We need a horror host on Channel 29.
It sort of took the edge of the scary off the movies, which was nice when I was so young.
Of course, there was Vampira.
I resent women with big bosoms. I had to fake mine.
Vampira was more seductive, more kind of quiet, very mysterious.
Yeah, wow. At some point, she was more interesting than the Killer Shrews.
And then, of course, 20 years of Chili Billy Cardilli, Bill Cardell.
I've had that name now, Chili Billy, since 1963.
Your creature features, I love the cigar. I love the rocking chair. No, that wasn't me. That was another guy.
I just sort of walked into everything I did.
The thing that was amazing about that show was the invitation in it that was kind of like you could make a show.
Well, heck, I can do that. I can probably do it better.
It was the most exquisite experience of my life to do that show.
It showed how we started this whole business of introducing late-night scary movies on television. Aren't you glad?
Documentary feature-length that came out in 2006, chronicles the rise, the evolution, the culture impact of horror hosts on TV. Svengoolie, Elvira, those are kind of, if there's like a Mount Rushmore, you have to kind of include them. But even the people that came before them, Zachary, Vampira, all you have to do is Google image search Vampira, and you'll see the connection to Elvira. The documentary features a lot of folks: Tim Conway, Tom Savini, Leonard Maltin, Joel Hodgson from Mr. Science Theater 3000, all of us being byproducts of the 80s. It just felt like a good conversation to have because horror hosts have maybe been peripheral to us growing up. You guys growing up on Long Island, me growing up in Chicago. See where the horror hosting conversation goes.
John and I growing up on Long Island and in New York, I think a lot of times people that aren't from there get this misnomer. Well, maybe it's not a misnomer. We are the center of the universe in our own minds. But surprisingly enough, like we didn't have, like you grew up with Svengoolie or Son of Svengoolie. We didn't really have the horror hosts. Like we had like Monster Week on PIX 11 and Channel 7 and things like that.
And now the Godzilla-thon begins.
He's mean, green, and making the New York scene with 4 of his favorite films. Starting with Godzilla's Revenge. He doesn't get mad, he gets even. Stay tuned and tally the score.
The Godzilla marathons and the Planet of the Apes marathons, but we didn't have that one horror host locally. I mean, apparently there were in the 60s, 70s, like Zachary, I think, was like a New York, but that was more like in the city, I think, and maybe cable access there. So it's interesting to me, and John, I don't know if you want to chime in on that, but it's interesting to me to kind of have come at the horror host thing, like you said, Bernie, on my periphery when I was younger. It's like an interesting subculture to me, but not one that I was steeped in growing up because we just didn't have one in our neck of the woods.
Yeah, this was pretty much all new to me. And I guess maybe the only person that I can even relate this to back when we were younger was like a Wolfman Jack, which was more obviously is music related. But back in the day, he did a couple of like midnight Halloween type shows. And I just remember having like the coolest feeling of staying up late and what's going to happen on this show. And they would just play some like shtick recordings of different little like horror stories and ghost stories. It's really, really kind of lighter stuff. But I really was not exposed to this until like Elvira's on TV or doing, some things on streaming. I had heard of a few people, and then obviously I moved to the Midwest, had the exposure to Svengoolie, which again, had never even heard of him before. And I probably lived here a good 8 years at least or so until I had even heard of him.
There's something you mentioned, John, that I think is really interesting. That idea of like the time of night. Wolfman Jack, right? You're staying maybe up a little later than your curfew allows if you can coerce your parents to let you do that. My wife always talks about how she was allowed to basically stay up through like the theme song to Hill Street Blues. Maybe you get through like the Carson monologue. For an era we have streaming and everything's on demand, that may not mean something to people that are listening, but there's a generation of folks where those were just like milestones in the evening. The Carson monologue meant the local news was done, and now you're kind of getting into the late night. So maybe your parents are asleep, and if they've fallen asleep before you and they're careless as parenting goes, then maybe they let you stay up and watch a movie. And at that point, you're watching hopefully a good horror movie, a good action movie that's just kind of on WGN in my end of the woods or Pix in your end of the woods. But there is something neat, I think, about that time of night, breaking a curfew because you might have one watching something that you're not supposed to be watching.
I mean, for me, it wasn't necessarily the horror thing, but when I was growing up and my parents were out on a Saturday night, it was coercing the babysitter to let me stay up to watch Fantasy Island after the Love Boat on Saturday nights, which, I don't think I could relate to much of anything on Fantasy Island at that age, but it was just the idea of staying up past your bedtime. And I remember like the negotiations, and if I was able to convince the babysitter, she'd be like, okay, but once you hear the car come in the driveway, you got to run into bed and pretend you're asleep. And I'm like, deal. And so, my parents happened to get home late. I could maybe get all of Fantasy Island in, and maybe there might be a horror movie or something on after that might be able to get a couple of minutes in at that age. But yeah, that was my main goal, was like, getting past the opening credits of Tattoo yelling, "The plane bath."
Yeah, my parents were pretty strict, so there were a few of those nights, whether it was listening to the awful New York Knicks of my childhood or trying to stay up late for some of these shows, it was usually without my parents' knowledge with the little boom box maybe under the blankets, which again just kind of adds a little bit to that overall feel and experience versus the I'm going to stream this at 3 p.m. because it's always on.
And because you can always hit play. There's something like I remember a few late nights where WGN after the news would air reruns of like The Terminator or Blade Runner.
The year is 2150 and planet Earth has been invaded by a regiment of super intelligent robots. Tomorrow night at 11:30, Peter Cushing and Ray Brooks star in the science fiction thriller Invasion of Earth 2150 AD.
I was just young enough where something like Blade Runner went a little bit over my head, but I just coerced my parents to let me watch a little bit of like the late night news, because maybe I was like, I need to see what Andre Dawson and Ryan Sandberg are doing right now. It's like, I give a rat's ass about what they're doing on the field. I need to watch this Terminator movie. Come on, Schwarzenegger, come on now. And maybe I'd get through like the first 20 minutes of it. But all of this stuff, like whether you're watching this on Pix or whatever, there's also the other piece of going to recess the next day. That, you know, like what we kind of call now water cooler talk, which is also in some ways a bit extinct, I would say, because we don't have a lot of that communal experience. Because like you said, John, you can go 3 p.m. if you're home and you can hit play and you could watch Terminator, versus maybe as a kid running into it at like 9:30, 10:30 p.m. when you're up a little later. And then the next day you can go to school and tell all your buddies, and I want to get a cool leather jacket like Michael Biehn, and I want to saw off a shotgun. This is what I want to do with my life. There's just something about that where you could just go to school, have that conversation. I think in the same ways, like where we would have that communal experience of like going to a movie, where maybe you can get your parents or your friend's parents to take you in the minivan or wood paneled station wagon to see a movie. And then you guys get to talk about it afterwards, but also the next day. There's something about that feels like it's missing, and not from a like get off my lawn for people who might be listening kind of way, but just from the like, oh yeah, I remember people talking about the Seinfeld season finale because it was a cultural moment. Everyone was kind of experiencing it at the same time. So we all talked about it. And before my time, I heard people talk about MASH and how that became a cultural moment. And I think there's something there not too dissimilar maybe from Horror Host, because if a lot of people are just watching the same thing at the same time, when you meet the same people that are watching it, you kind of already start on second base. You were watching Svengoolie too, and the brain that wouldn't die. All right, well, we already have a few things in common there. So that's kind of cool.
Pete and I did that all the time when we were younger. So we would like, you know, we'd meet up in school on a Monday or Tuesday and be like, I was watching, you know, Friday the 13th part 3 came on. I was watching it too. And again, you know, some of these movies were replayed quite a bit, but you were sitting in front of the TV at 8 or 9 p.m. and watching HBO, which we were all like flipping through these channels. So we had a lot more shared experiences in the exact moment. People have, you know, shared experiences all the time still, but people pick and choose when they're going to watch. Some binge, some don't. And it is just different. You don't have that jumping off point. Somebody's on, you know, episode 2 of season 1 and someone else is done already, you know, like the whole series. So it does make it a little more difficult to share in that experience.
Well, and I distinctly remember, and this is just how my brain works, like to what John was saying, like there was one time it was like a late night. There was like nothing on. This was like the era of cable. So we had options, and like we got to school the next day on the Monday, and he's like, you know, I ended up watching License to Drive with the 2 Coreys. I'm like, I was watching it too, like classic 2 Coreys movie, but it was like blowing our minds that we just, because there was no real reason for it. It wasn't like anything was pre-planned. It was just like we were both in the same situation on like Saturday night when it was like 11 or midnight. We couldn't sleep, or we didn't want to go to sleep yet. We're just flipping through the cable channels, and that's what we both happened to land on. So it was like, oh, this is interesting. But I think another interesting aspect of it is, like, not to age us too badly, but John and I grew up in the age where when we were kids, we had 13 channels. And then with the advent of cable, another happenstance coincidence of us growing up is that both our fathers were electricians. And so in the early 80s, like our dads were coming home with the illegal cable boxes so we could get cable for free, which was another kind of punk rock, like cool thing. Like if you had like the illegal cable box, it was like awesome until, you know, whenever they figured out and scrambled the signal, and then our dads had to go out and get a different cable box. So it was like the constant challenge of staying one step ahead of the man. But what with the advent of cable, like now you've got all these options with HBO, Showtime, TBS, USA. That's how I became aware of someone like Commander USA's Groovy Movies on Saturday afternoon.
Groovy Movies are as much fun as a one-ring circus. Groovy Movies are as much fun as being lost in the jungle in the Philippines. Groovy movies are as much fun as bass fishing in Scotland. Commander USA here in the Video Vault, inviting you to join me on Saturdays, because groovy movies are fun. Tomorrow!
This is USA, America's all-entertainment network.
So that was one of my earliest touch points with like a horror host. I think Elvira was certainly in the ether at that point too, because Cassandra Peterson just did a masterful job of marketing herself and just really exploding through what you were saying, Bernie, that like little niche, could be very regional phenomenon of the horror host. So, and I think what the horror hosts do is provide like this communal experience. And so if you were renting 4 or 5 horror movies from the video store and having sleepovers, you kind of got that. Same thing watching something on cable late night with some friends or my cousin Mark in a sleepover, you got something like that. But I think what it was the appeal to not just myself, but maybe all of us and a lot of people was like that communal figure that's kind of guiding you through some of these movies, some of them which are great, like the classic Universal monster movies, some of which are absolutely horrible. And the three of us have waxed poetic on the so bad it's good aspect of those movies. There's something enjoyable about that too. And maybe we can get into like the different types of horror hosts, but I really feel like they almost serve like 3 different purposes. They're entertainer, they are film historian, and there's like a third, I don't know what you would call it, but they're almost kind of like a shepherd of like a gatekeeper, a crypt keeper, if you will, of letting people in, especially like the younger crowd. Like when we interviewed Larry Underwood, Dr. Gangrene, he talked about this, like he took it as like a big part of what he does is being that gateway to little kids to be like, oh, hey, here's, this is the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I'm going to tell you about the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I really love this movie, and hopefully after I'm done talking about it, you're going to love it too. So there's like this, bringing people into that world and instilling that love of horror into new fans.
I'm really glad you brought up USA, because there's also that other piece about USA's Up All Night with Gilbert Gottfried.
Hi, I'm Gilbert Gottfried. I'm with my pals, the Star Riders. We're watching 2 films tonight, Porky's 2 the next day, and Fat Guy Goes Nutsoid. What can I tell you? I was born to be wild.
I think there's something also too about like horror hosts, the horror is usually like the capital part in that, where they have the eye makeup and the hat and the cape, creepy and maybe vamp looking, but it's not always that. I think to your point, Pete, like sometimes it's just like when we were talking to Dr. Gangrene, it could be like Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone. It could be Hitchcock in the Hitchcock Hour show, where it's just someone that we've all kind of grown up with, but kind of serves the purpose of the horror host.
Well, and there's a couple ideas that really hit me watching this documentary, because again, not growing up, having thought about this as much. We had a couple, like you said, USA, and everybody knew about Elvira, but I just really didn't grow up watching horror hosts. So this was really my first chance to think about what does that host provide for each person. Obviously, like you said, there's different types of hosts. Another interesting thing that this documentary brought up for me was, how do people like consume horror? And then when you're younger, when we were younger, again, I shouldn't say when you're younger, because every generation is different, but back in the 70s and 80s for me, and this might not be anybody else's feeling, but I felt like watching horror was more of a lonely type thing. Horror movies now are everything. They've exploded. They're making decent money. There's a lot of different streaming sites that have a variety of different types of horror. You have Shudder that is just horror related.
Now, John, when you say lonely, do you mean it just wasn't like as accepted? Like it was kind of like, kind of maybe like looked down upon if you were watching a horror movie?
It was a little bit of everything. I felt like it was a little more niche. We didn't have as many movies that we could just readily, watch. I mean, you're running to the video store and you have your Friday the 13th and Halloweens, but then it's like, a lot of us were watching these rated R movies before we were of age. You had to like try to figure out a way to get that to your house. And if you do, like, you're going to have like a group of people. It wasn't always like a group of people. I feel like, it was like Pete and I would watch them. Every once in a while, you might have a birthday party and watch something with a group. But otherwise, there wasn't as many movies in the theater that were mainstream horror that you would just, I'm going to go see whatever. I mean, there was just an occasional. Now there's so many. So I feel like in a lot of ways, the host for me, again, not having gone through having a local host, but it probably would have meant kind of decreasing that loneliness factor and increasing the legitimacy a little bit of having somebody to watch it with in an odd way.
There's also a little bit, I'll just speak for the time, because I think it's changed a lot from when we were growing up. But at the time, there was like the social acceptance of it too. John and I were super shy kids growing up, and when we start to hit puberty and girls get on the radar, like if you're going to school and someone maybe that you've got a crush on asks like, "What did you do this weekend?" Like, and your answer is, "I watched Godzilla versus Megalon." Like 99 times out of 100, that's really you're not gonna get much farther than that, So, which is not to say that there aren't girls and women that love all that stuff, but back then for us, it was very difficult to pinpoint who those people might be. And so, it was a lot of just like with your guy friends, like, I remember Mike Cognato, who we grew up with. He was just like, "Hey, why don't you come over to my house every day this week and we'll watch every Friday the 13th movie?" And like, that was like exciting for me. I'm like, yeah, that's going to be great. We were like doing our own programming, on some level, because he had all the tapes. So I was like, okay, we're like in his wood paneled basement watching Friday the 13th every day. Like, I'd come over after school, we'd watch a movie, I'd get home in time for dinner, and that was like the whole week, and I loved it.
Jason is back. 3 times before, you have felt the terror, known the madness, lived the horror. But this is the one you've been screaming for. Because Friday, April 13th, will be Jason's unlucky day. Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
I wasn't telling all my friends that I was doing that, because still at the time there's that little bit of, is this really socially acceptable? Like, oh, you're into horror? Like, are you weird? Like, there's like the stereotype of like, you're going to be a little bit weird. And in retrospect, yeah, we are. Everyone's a little bit weird, but we were so shy. Like, you don't want to embrace that mantle because you're trying so hard to fit in. Any little thing that's going to keep you away from trying to get in with any in-group at that point, when you're still trying to figure out who you are, is, it's a huge deal. So I get the loneliness aspect that you're talking about.
The documentary in some ways kind of bears that, where you see that it seems to be a lot of folks who are very passionate about, I don't want to say the industry and like the world they live in, because some of them are horror hosts, some of them are people like Tom Savini that obviously are in the world of horror and grew up with horror hosts. Social acceptance. I think the other piece is probably like access, because you had that friend Pete that had the tapes for Friday the 13th. So you were able to watch it. You had, and I think we're past whatever jurisdiction or whatever regarding having illicit cable, but you had access to cable and you could see some of these movies that were rerun endlessly on HBO. So you could see Beastmaster or Friday the 13th Part 3 countless times. And when I go back again to that conversation with Dr. Gangrene, it's 1957, the shock package, and that was Columbia, that goes to all of these TV stations when there were less than 14. You're hearing the boom of television stations starting to grow throughout the U.S. So there are more channels. Everything is local. Now you have the need for content, which I think also makes sense for something like USA. I think I'll come back to that. But that idea, like you have a new station in Chicago or any major metropolitan area, and you need to put something on the airwaves. Now Columbia's given you Dracula, The Mummy, Frankenstein, movies that were from the 30s, but now airing in 57. And if you were kids like us growing up, we didn't have the option to, again, go to streaming and hit play and just watch a movie we didn't catch at the theater because it's not available anymore. These kids were like, oh, I've heard of The Mummy, I've heard of Frankenstein, and now I get to see it. Maybe I got to stay up late to do it. It just felt like a lot of this stuff, the way the documentary was kind of presenting it, the way we've kind of heard about it, It was necessity. You needed to fill the air times. And some of these people, whether they were like Chilly Billy, like a weatherman, that was just the person who rose their hand.
Hi, I'm Bill Cardille, Chilly Billy.
A lot of it goes back to like carnies and vaudeville and what they call it, like spook shows. Oh yeah, when you say it through that lens, there is no context for this. So what are you doing? You're playing a little bit of Rod Serling with maybe some beatnik, or in my case, like the original Svengoolie Jerry Bishop, who had a lot of like hippie in him. Like now I see it. Before that, I didn't know. I was just like, guy wears a lot of tie-dye shirts and obviously does not have a love for rubber chickens, but I don't get it. Now I see it. I'm like, oh, I totally get it. Even growing up on Bozo Show, WGN in Chicago. Oh yeah, if you just tilted that towards Ed Wood movies, okay, I get it now. You're doing the same thing. It's not Howdy Doody. It's scary movies.
Do you guys have a preferred type of host when it comes to horror that you like for a specific type of reason? I mean, it doesn't have to be one. I would say I have two. I feel like everybody's kind of looking for something a little bit different when they're watching these movies. Like you have people ushering you in, introducing you to, you have people that seem like they're more like straight entertainers that are kind of doing their own thing, that are trying to be part of the show, if you will. Do you guys have like a preferred type?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have a preferred type. I appreciate, just from some of the footage that I've seen through the documentary and on some videos, I appreciate the hosts that are super quick-witted, because there's a lot of like goofy shtick that goes on with a lot of them. And it's like, you know, here's a product that, you know, what, there was someone, I saw something like, instead of Listerine, they just drew like a B on it. It's like, it's Blisterine. But that's like, you know, that's the stupid shit that John and I did, you know, growing up with the video camera, like making our own shows. So like, you know, the stupid puns is right up my alley. But so many of these are like DIY, even the ones that were like produced in like local TV stations. Like the sets are like really low key, you know, which is part of the charm. And I think there's just something to like when something kind of goes slightly awry or slightly wrong that, you know, was not scripted or intended, and they're able to kind of just roll with it. That probably just speaks to like the entertainer part of it. But I really appreciate the ones that just kind of roll with it and kind of turn that into a joke. There's definitely a skill there involved that's like, they probably are primed that anything could go wrong at a moment's notice doing some of this stuff. So I got to be ready to be on top of my game. And that's how I think a lot of them probably lasted 20, 30 plus years doing this. What about you, Bernie? Do you have a particular horror host type?
I'm going to use your template, right? So there's the usher, there's the information giver, maybe. And then at the third one, is it fair to say it's kind of like more of the shtick camp person that almost is less about the info and more about like their thing?
It's like, you know, there's like the Venn diagram, because a lot of them overlap and cross. And
yep, I'd probably say a little bit of the usher / camp. Again, I think the one thing we all agree on is like a lot of these movies that at least were featured in this documentary, they were from an era where the movies weren't good, or at least they were so bad they were good. And I think there's something really self-aware in that these horror hosts knew that their audience wasn't watching a good movie, and it was late at night. And then in some cases, it was a bunch of college kids smoking weed at the same time. So you're there to basically let them know, yep, there's a commercial coming up and it's for Listerine and it's boring. So let's have a little fun with it. And then we'll be right back. Getting them through the movie, because the movie can be a slog. There's like that Venn diagram you talked about, Pete, like somewhere there, Svengoolie always shared a little bit of information, which I really appreciated.
Hey, we've learned that psycho murderers can be nice to their mothers, so it's probably a good time to cover the 4 main types of serial killers, according to what the Crack TNT Research Department found out for me. The first type of serial killer is the visionary type. Now, this is the type who kills because he hears voices or has visions. They claim, God told me to kill all the prostitutes, or Satan told me to kill anybody driving a green Yugo. If you're this type, plead insanity, all right? The second type of serial killer is the mission-oriented type. This is basically the same as the first type, except that there are no voices involved. The killer thinks of it all himself. I'm going to rid society of all people who wear Birkenstocks. They think they're doing the community a big service, and they probably are, now that I think about ridding the society of Birkenstocks. If you're this type, your neighbors will always be quoted as saying, he was such a nice young man. The third type is my personal favorite, the hedonistic type. This is the type who kill because they like it. like Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs with his fava beans and Chianti. Of course, he's fictitious, but there are real guys like that who we'll cover at the next break. But if you're this type, you have experienced peakerism. If I tell you what peakerism is, my show will probably get canceled, but let's just say that one person's getting very physically happy while the other person's getting very physically dead. All right, I better move on to the fourth type of serial killer, which is the power control-oriented type. This is where Ted Bundy falls in. This type gets his happies from the capture and control of his powerless victim and making them obey his every command. They like to feel important. They're aware of the rules of society, but choose to ignore them. So if you have problems picking up chicks without a crowbar in your hand, probably this type, like Ted Bundy. Of course, that means I can't pick up chicks under any circumstances, so maybe I'm that type. Maybe we should get back to the flick. Go. That's about the only thing I hadn't tried, too. You know what happened if I tried that? The girl would say, you're not really gripping that crowbar correctly. I have a boyfriend who really knows how to use that crowbar. You see, this is freaky times we live in, you know? People are into all kinds of stuff.
I think Joe Bob Briggs has done that as well, like where they talk about the number of deaths, let alone the number of boobs that may be in the movie. Like that's always kind of part of the breakdown. But there's always something really interesting about, like you said, seeing someone who's just so quick-witted and good at it. Everything doesn't land and it's not polished, and that's the best. If I ever did horror hosting, I don't think I'd have a talent for camp, so I would probably be more of like, I forget his name, but the guy who starts TCM, and he's like, hey, so tonight we're going to watch Spartacus, and a little bit of information about Spartacus. Okay, this is good, but I'm going to need some Visine because this is a little boring. That would be me. I would be that guy. I'd be like, I'm going to share some things because I don't know if I can make you laugh. So I'm always in awe when I do see someone who's super talented. I think that's just who the person is. If we saw them at like a party, that's just them. It just happens that they're on TV right now.
You're Joe Bob Briggs-esque with your recall ability of and knowledge of genres and things like that, which I don't think is any secret that anyone that's listened to this podcast for any time can attest to. So
if I could have taken all that empty space, Pete, and I would have learned French and maybe understood the stock market. But in the meantime,
I'm right there with you. I don't have quite your recall, but I've got a lot of useless space taken up in my brain that could have been better used to further any other number of endeavors in my life.
I think,
John, what about you?
So much depends on your age and what you're looking for and what you're looking to get out of it. And also, it kind of depends on the type of movie, too. Like if it's a really good quality movie, even if it's old, like an old Universal like Dracula, or if it's something, more schlock, or if it's something that's like a Hammer film that's got a little more gore and a little creepiness to it. If I want to be creeped out, I kind of like having a character that's a little creepy, even if they have a little shtick. Like having the modern Svengoolie. He takes you out of that a little bit because it's so much on the lighter side of the humor. I love him as a host too, and he provides for me more of that just real forget about life, tell the corniest jokes that we can, like to the point where you're like, oh my gosh, and he's making fun of himself after almost every single joke.
Oh, who are you supposed to be?
Not supposed to be. I am Dracula's great granddaughter.
Okay, how do you figure that?
Well, I sent in one of those family tree DNA tests, and the results showed I am a direct descendant of Vlad the Impaler, the real Count Dracula.
Gwen, looks like you're barking up the wrong family tree. According to this, you're a direct descendant of Vlad the Inhaler, the inventor of that asthma relief thing, not Vlad the Impaler.
What? Give me that! I demand a refund! I want my vial of spit back!
So I like that for some of like the real schlocky kinds of movies, but there's something to be said too for like the Elvira, who's kind of like the crossover, or I'm guessing Vampira was like this too, with like being able to be quick-witted, tell some jokes, being in character and a little creepy, looking amazing. The funny thing is, like, I didn't really watch Elvira's stuff when I was younger. I don't know if I really had access to it, but by the time her movies and things came out, her type of comedy shtick was not really my kind of comedy. And that kind of goes along with some of the other topics we've talked about with, like, say, your riff tracks or your mystery science theater. Mm-hmm. Like, I like a certain amount of joking about the movie, but then I also like to kind of keep that atmosphere going of the film. And that's a delicate balance in a lot of ways. I feel like Svengoolie does it well because he just goes over the top, so that shtick is coming, and there's no doubt about it. Definitely seems to be a bit of a delicate balance. And like you said before, Bernie, I mean, these people are pretty talented to be able to do this for this amount of time. I think in the documentary, a few of them alluded to, I just kind of ran out of ideas. Like it was time to move on because I had done everything that I could do.
And they'd already covered all the public domain movies they could. So that was probably the other reason. Now, how about this? Do you guys prefer your hosting to be more family friendly? Like I was thinking, John, like Svengoolie, I think as he has become more national, has probably become a little less risque. I grew up with him. So and I mean, I remember Jerry Bishop, but again, at that time, it was old for me. So Fox, which again, mother of invention, as WFLD was becoming the new Fox affiliate in Chicago, they were starred for programming. And before Tracy Ullman and The Simpsons and In Living Color, they were literally airing a Jerry Bishop old Svengoolie episodes on Saturday afternoons. And when you air that, what is that? That's a 2-hour block. You got 2 hours of programming. It reminds me a lot of Mystery Science Theater, and I think it was or the Laugh Channel, or before one of them became Comedy Central. Hey, you get 2 hours. Why? Because that's 2 hours of programming. That's great. You're going to air The Brain That Wouldn't Die, and you're going to make fun of it for 2 hours. Great. And there's something about that. So do you guys have a preference, especially John, because you watch Svengoolie now, where he definitely leans more family friendly, or do you prefer maybe more of that Joe Bob Briggs, or even you mentioned Pete, Commander USA, Gilbert Godfrey, where it's all right, it's a little later, so we can have a little bit more fun and have quadruple entendres?
I'm more of a fan of the classic presentation, so maybe more of a Vincent Price or somebody like an Elvira who could be in character but still deliver the quick wit. But I do love that there are family-friendly options now because, again, some of these movies are not all that scary. It would be really ridiculous to present it so over the top while it's not a really scary movie. My perfect situation would be if they had something like that, like Svengoolie, 7 to 9 like they do now, and then maybe they come back again at 10:30 or 10 o'clock at night and do a darker movie with a darker type host.
Svengoolie After Dark?
Yeah, but a different host though.
Oh, I thought. Are you looking for the Baywatch Nights of Svengoolie now?
Well, I guess, or something just you can.
I'm picturing Svengoolie in a one piece.
Yeah. Well, if you had to run a darker movie, something that was a little more gore, a little PG-13 R rating.
I think as Rich Coase has gotten older, not that he's lost a step, but as Rich Coase, who's Svengoolie, has gotten a little older, I think he's kind of opened the door for the Sven Squad, the new 3 horror hosts that have come in, and they do the same thing exactly you're talking about, John. We're 7 to 9:30, you get Svengoolie, and we get to watch Frankenstein versus the Space Monster. And if you heard the title, that's exactly what you're getting.
This week on Svengoolie,
he could turn into a Frankenstein.
Yeah, a weird Frankenstein.
Nobody would believe it.
Add some bizarre aliens, and you've got Frankenstein meets the Space Monster on the next Svengoolie. Saturday night on MeTV.
And then at 9:30, the Blair Witch Project, which blew me away. This is on a Svengoolie type show, but it definitely had a little bit more teeth to the commentary and to the tone. It doesn't happen every week, but I think as they're trying to find their footing and still keep that family-friendly tone, on occasion they'll throw in something like Saturday the 14th. That was something that they did not that long ago. And I'm I don't think Svengoolie would do that, but they can get away with it.
Yeah, and they did edit it down a little bit. It almost reminded me of the USA TBS version of a horror movie you would get. But yeah, and again, I know there's so many things at play there with if you can put on a dual show like that, but I do like the idea of, you send the kids off to bed and then the adults watch something that's creepier with a darker type of a host just in general. It doesn't have to be the same host because I don't think that would work as well. And that's, like you said, that's something that they're kind of toying with a little bit. I think somebody will figure out that formula here soon.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because a lot of it's so dependent on the movie that you're showing. Like, you're not going to do the family friendly thing for something like Reanimator because, like, you know, it's so discordant. I guess you could, like, if you wanted to do it ironically, that would probably be fun and entertaining. But like, if you're got a syndicated show or something like Svengoolie on MeTV that's taken on this very family friendly guise to it, like, you can't be running out movies like that and do what he does, because it's, you know, it doesn't work. So
welcome to the 27-minute TV edit of Reanimator.
Yeah, right, not even thinking about just like, the TV edits, but like I think, like, I tend to, I mean, I like something that's got a little bit of an edge. I like something that could be for kids but has like the double, triple entendres, the extra meanings. But that being said, you know, I got to go see Joe Bob Briggs when he came to the Carolina Theater and did the double feature with Bubba Hotep and Donnie Darko. You know, he was great. And, you know, I'm not, again, like, I'm peripheral in this subculture. So, like, I know a lot of, like, the bigger names, and obviously I know who Joe Bob Briggs is, but I'm not, like, a dedicated follower. I'm not watching Last Drive-In and things like that all the time. So, but I'm like, this should be fun and should be entertaining and it should be an experience. And it was all of that. His knowledge of horror history and cinema is just absolutely ridiculous. And for him to kind of be up there just kind of riffing before the films and just giving tangentially and, you know, related to what we're about to see, like, just talking about, like, all aspects of this stuff, it was just mind blowing. And, you know, and he's not afraid to drop, like, the F-bombs when he needs to. And it's like, it's an older audience and it's an adult audience. It was like, you know, it was a later show. We've been talking, like both of you have said, I think there's place for all of that. You know, a lot of these hosts have been doing it for so long. I think what comes through with a lot of them is just the passion that they have for it, because you can't be doing this for 5, 10, 15, 20 years without having the passion. None of these people, with the exception of very few, Elvira and a couple others, that are making any kind of money off of this stuff. All of this is really just the love of doing it. So I think a lot of them, find what their niche is, what they're good at, and what speaks to them and resonates with whatever audience they have. And I don't think any of these hosts are trying too hard to be something that they're not. Like, you don't really, again, in my limited exposure to it, you don't really see a lot of these hosts like trying to be like, I'm going to be edgy, when that's not really their personality or not really their character, and vice versa. They all kind of seem to settle in where they need to be, and that's what gets presented to the audience.
All right, and that's the end of part 1 of our conversation about the American Scary documentary and horror hosting in general. Pete, John, and myself will be back for part 2, where we'll continue our discussion. We'll talk about Elvira, the evolution of horror hosting, especially with technology, how from cable access channels, now we see horror hosts on YouTube and Twitch and so much more. So tune in for part 2. And thank you for listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast.